What is education? What's it for? And how do we best achieve it? These are questions we really have to address if we're to live successful lives and thrive outside the matrix. Hi, I'm Nigel Howitt, giving you a glimpse of life outside the matrix today. And on the show, we are continuing our discussion of education. And it's a great pleasure once again to be joined by educational consultant and personal coach, Mark Neale. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time. And once again, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Great. So the purpose of the show is to really encourage people to think about the idea of education. So I've just to catch us up and everybody else, a very brief summary of what we said last time. You defined education, Mark, as a system which is very dependent upon purpose and the philosophy behind it, a system of imparting knowledge to either groups or individuals. And I added my thoughts of education as a process of acquiring knowledge for the purpose of living an effective life on earth. So we both identified that purpose and the philosophical assumptions are really important, and of course everyone would say they're up for education, but so were the Nazis and so forth. So we have to
Exactly.
we have to define what it is we're trying to achieve. You made the great point that educational support is best personalized or tailored to specific requirements of each child. And we both sort of agreed that makes the modern classroom situation a little bit impractical, and it tends to speak to and support to education in the home and in the community where possible. But of course, within the matrix, that's not possible, and one needs to address a very different, if you like, lifestyle in order to make that happen. We briefly touched on education as demonstration. You mentioned that there's no firewall. It's not just the textbook the children get. They get everything about the teacher or the parent. They get our whole way of being. So that's quite an important one for all of us to remember, isn't it? All of us as parents and as educationalists. And we touched upon that children don't want to go to school a lot of the time. You mentioned the sort of metaphorical sort of heads hung down sort of vision of the average school child on a Monday morning looking particularly depressed. And I can't help suspecting that that's because they have no say in the matter. You countered, I think, quite effectively with the fact that African children or people from other nations where there's no educational system or a very minimal one would be very keen and enthusiastic to join in, and I think the difference there is individual choice. The whole contract of being in the institution, when it's been bought into by choice, changes that whole context, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We then you made a fantastic point about conditioning, or is it education? Is it conditioning or education? And we again, I think we both sort of arrived at a conclusion together that it's more a process of thought, perhaps that turns this informational download into knowledge as opposed to a conditioned response. So the difference sort of essentially boiling down to force versus volitional thought. And the last point we asked was, is education active or passive? And I think, again, we both agreed that it's more of an active process.
Yeah.
And I would, add from my perspective, inside the mainstream or in the matrix, it's very much a passive thing. Most people think you just go to school and you receive this education without putting much in. Outside the matrix, of course, it's very active. Did you want to comment on any of those thoughts, Mark, or are you happy to just move straight along?
I'm really impressed at the thoroughness of your review, but no, otherwise I'll just start going. I can just start firing off on any of those.
Great, excellent.
Actually, let me contradict myself. Let me just put one thing in here. Before we go, I have no problem with a structured, disciplined education. I just think it has to be a lot bigger than perhaps we perceive at the moment. Sometimes people think, you're just purely for free education, in the sense of the child just does what they want. Actually, no, I subscribe to the fact that the children don't know that much. That's why we need to educate them.
Yeah.
If you put them in a sweet shop, they'll eat everything. If you give them money, they'll spend it on the most unhelpful things. So I passionately believe in education, and I have no problem with structure and form, because I think they allow us to measure, but we have to be a lot more holistic than we are. to be really effective.
Yes, absolutely. A great point. And I would add to that, I mean, without contradicting that at all, and we can discuss this later, I'm very keen to discuss the difference between a hands-off model of education versus a more structured. And I would also add into that I think structured educational establishments are a very good thing. For me, the important issue is choice. It's whether or not it's compulsory and or whether it's bought into volitionally. And I think that's like a fork in the road mentally, where if you've chosen to be there, your whole approach is going to be receptive and constructive. Whereas if you have to be there, you're going to be gazing out the window, feeling resentment. and it's a waste of time. So I mean, I think it's interesting. What I like about conversing with you, Mark, is that I think we have quite sort of complementary different views. We're bringing different things to the table here. So hopefully the listeners will benefit from that too. One thing I was just going to dive in with was a definition of knowledge, because I've used the word, I used it in the last episode where we discussed education, without offering a definition. So I'd like to put one forward here, and please, you counter with your thoughts. This is a definition offered by a philosopher, David Kelly, and he says that knowledge is the organisation of our direct, that is perceptual, experience of reality. We organise our perceptions conceptually so that we can understand the world and so that we can live successfully in it. Our purposes and needs and the requirements of our lives shape that perceptual organisation. So in a nutshell, knowledge is awareness in conceptual form. So I just wanted to throw that in. Thinking, of course, being the method of acquiring knowledge, as we discussed last time, and absence of that leading to conditioning, and logic being the method of organising one's thinking, and of course reason is the faculty, conscious faculty we use. So did you want to sort of add or comment on knowledge as a general, since we're talking about the acquisition of knowledge?
I'm definitely not going to pick a fight with the philosopher. I think he's absolutely right, and I think we have to remember that if we accept that definition, knowledge can be wrong. So we can have a set of perceptions, we can organise our thoughts in a certain way, but those aren't necessarily helpful. And you could actually take that back to the purpose of education, for example. People's knowledge, their perception, their organisational thinking of that is very often mistaken. And I would want to bring us right back to the basics that I think most of us would agree. Poverty is horrible. It's something we want to eliminate. And one of the biggest cures for poverty is actually education. But it's how do we perceive education? And I think where we've gone wrong is we wedge kids into a system and we disseminate information, and that's something different again. So I was pleased when you brought the definition forward, that we're not talking about information here. It's how do we deal with what we see around us, and how do we put that up, and then how do we put that together, and how do we respond to that?
Yeah, I think maybe it's worth mentioning that I kind of agree with you, but just a different angle. Mm-hmm. I think that it's information that can be wrong. I would say that once we've because information it is possible to identify which information is correct and which isn't, with the will to do so. And the modern educational system, as you said, it has a set of information, a syllabus, and it assumes it's all correct. It assumes it's all relevant, even for the projected future, and it seeks to download that and make that into knowledge. My thoughts are that knowledge is once you have accurate information about reality. Knowledge is that fire burns your finger. It isn't that fire floats around and so information can be wrong is something that I'd just throw into that.
Information can definitely be wrong. This is really interesting. We'll have to do this another time more deeply over a drink. But if we use your matrix analogy, the people in the matrix, what their knowledge tells them is that they're living in a reality. Whereas when we add to that knowledge, that then actually that's incorrect. So it is this line between
That's a good
information, but if the knowledge is how I organize my life, and that's what I live by, then that organization can actually be incorrect. That perception can be incorrect. And people struggle with this because what happens is it threatens their sense of certainty.
Yeah.
Well, I see it and I think I know what I'm seeing, and I've called that reality. And then when someone like you comes along with a podcast like this and you start going poke, 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 people aren't necessarily arguing with your perspective. They're just scared because you're actually shaking what they thought was secure.
Great point. I like that a lot, actually, because as you said, the knowledge can be correct in accordance with a given philosophy. And if you took thank you. Well, let's go on to having sort of agreed that education is an active process where the child or the adult, the human being is seeking to acquire knowledge. How important is thinking, and how can we best encourage it, really? How can we get people thinking if we assume that thinking is needed?
I think we have to, first of all, decide what thinking is. And then if I just start going off on one here, you'll have to throw something at me or shout loud, because this is what I spend my day on as a coach, is, you're just dealing with thinking all the time. Was it Bernard Shaw who said 90% of people don't think, and then 5% of people think they think, but actually only 5% of us do. And so whether I can give an accurate definition, because obviously we haven't prepped for this, I'm not sure. But I think a big part of thinking is intentionality. I take what is presented to me as information, what's presented to me as knowledge, what's presented to me as truth, and I then intentionally put it through a process to see if it works and to challenge the assumptions. Yeah. And I think we sometimes see that as threatening or rebellious, because we feel we've got something to lose. So an insecure leader is threatened by questions or challenges, whereas actually the only way to progress is through questions and challenges.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you just get stuck, and then you just disintegrate from the inside.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. A big part of thinking is a lot of effort. It uses a lot of energy, but is deliberately saying, so okay, my children go to school, they go to lessons, they learn. What is learning? Do they learn? They go to school so they can have a happy future, that they can be economically stable, they understand our culture, they can live effectively in life in modern Britain. Can they? And that's not being, I'm not an anarchist. I think anarchy is the enemy. So just put my hands up there. I don't know where all the listeners are there. I really believe in order, but I don't believe in control.
Okay.
I believe in responsibility, that we take responsibility for our lives and we live in a position where we care for others. Anarchy destroys that. So that's why I don't like it. But if we do that, we're not being anarchic. We're just saying, does it work? Is the emperor actually dressed, or is that really his butt that I can see?
Yeah. Okay, well, maybe I can throw in my definition of thinking, coming broadly from Ayn Rand, although I don't know verbatim, but I can consider thinking to be an active and deliberate mental process with the acquisition of knowledge as its goal. And So, and I would totally agree that questioning is a fundamental part of this mental process. That there are all sorts of mental processes, of course, remembering, worrying, all these things that are mental activities, imagining, but thinking a specific mental process with the acquisition of knowledge as its goal, I should say. So we've
actually, I really like that. If we go back to your original definition, that works really well. And for me, the key is it's intentional. It's actually, I've actually got to engage here and do something.
Absolutely.
And interestingly, within schools, that's not taught as a rule.
No,
Is,
indeed.
I'm very hot on, critical thinking, challenge everything.
Absolutely. So also to challenge everything, I'm going to challenge your comments on anarchy there, because I do consider myself an anarchist, and again, it all comes down to definitions. I'm totally for freedom, as you've said, and for lack of control. So I'm absolutely for order, but I consider that order is best achieved not by coercing people and by education and through people arriving at their own rational values, thinking things through, questioning everything. And I think because we live in this one reality together, we all actually tune in onto the same page eventually. So my view of anarchy is just not being controlled. It's not being coerced into doing anything. It's certainly not running around, breaking windows and throwing bombs at people. I think again we've got two unique sort of viewpoints, and again, let's not get stuck on the semantics. So please respond to that if you want to, or let's look at the sort of volitional content of thinking. So thinking is required. It takes effort, as you've said. It's something that doesn't happen automatically. You can't just sit in the back of a classroom and attend, or rather attend in a physical sense, without attending with your focus and your mental, your conscious attention, paying attention, without that volitional component. Did you want to talk a little bit about that? About, again, how do we encourage people to think and to kickstart themselves?
I think everything you've asked there even goes back into what you were saying with your definition of anarchy. And I think I'm going to go deep and then answer the initial question. Is we have to decide what we want as a culture. And if you've got people who, through their unwillingness to think or inability to, who actually start to degrade our culture, they bring a threat to our freedom, then ironically, they then have to be forced to toe the line. So I'm not anti the law, I'm not anti establishment at all. I think, and I think maybe that's where, I listen to anarchists and I just think, no, that's not fair. If you're an anarchist, I can listen to you and go, yeah, I really hear the sense you're speaking, but then I hear some people and you're just angry and you don't want to be grown up.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're getting other people a bad press.
Absolutely.
But I think what happens... Sorry, go on.
I just think the essence is volition and non-coercion. But I absolutely agree. You can't... I'm not advocating pulling down the state tomorrow. I mean, that would be silly.
That's
people
cool.
aren't ready for that.
Really, really not. Is it possible? Yes, but we would do it in a voluntary way without firebombs or anything like that.
Completely.
But I think one of the things that I've identified is that there is a disconnect between why the child is going into the system and the outcome. And I think the parents make an assumption they've got to go to school or they won't be able to read, write, and do all these other good things. And now there's a truth there, but they haven't really worked it through. When I'm working with clients, I use the phrase chosen outcome. What do you want to be the end product? What do you want to happen? And we're lazy by default and says, well, I just want to get an education. That's not a good enough answer. And then the child is disconnected as well from the outcome. So they're almost, a lot of the time, it's almost a punishment, something that they're enduring. Whereas going back to what we spoke about last time, so I'm working with a little group of kids in Uganda right now. If I gave them the opportunity to go to even one of the poorer schools near you, they would leap at the chance. Why? Because what they see now is them living in a house with running water, paying their bills, driving a car, having food in the cupboard.
Yeah.
And so they just, this is how I get it. So they're going to be at the front of the class. They're going to be leaning in. They're going to be taking notes. They're going to be answering questions. Whereas the rest of the class are sitting there and go, wish I was on my PlayStation, wish I was playing football, wish I was hanging out with my mates, or they're trying to stay on social media without being seen. They've got a disconnect. And that's, one of the successes of our culture is that we have an abundance of food, we have an abundance of water. All these necessities more or less come to us freely. Whereas you parachute that kid into another culture, and then it's, if I don't take this action, I'm going to die.
Yes.
That's a really good motivator, and I don't want to sort of drive people through fear, but we've got a lot to lose. And I see it with students once they connect. So if I take my daughter, for example, super popular, homeschooled, lots of friends, social media all the time, but she's 15, and I'm just doing an advert here for homeschooling as well. So she's just finishing off her A-level standard studies at 15. Then she's going to do A-levels, and then she's going to medical school. She's already chosen her university. She's already looking at what courses she's going to do. She's already thinking about what she's going to be doing when she's 25, 26, 27. Now we can go, oh, they're just throwing away their childhood. No, she's planning her life. That's what she wants. And so she worked that back and said, if I want to be doing that, then I need to do this now. And that she's thought that. And so it comes back to that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. But what is it you think about your educational practice, your homeschooling method, if you like, that's encouraged her to do this thinking ahead? How have you managed to get her or to keep her curiosity? Because one point I'd make is that again, force and coercion tends to squash curiosity.
Yeah.
Curiosity, I think, is there by default in all young human beings, and it is the sort of part of the life force, isn't it? The curiosity, just finding
100%.
out. So how do we encourage that, and how do you think you've achieved that with your daughter? How have you got her to think that?
I think you have to give some of the credit to the individual, that they buy into that. And then I think there's a number of things. I mean, you just said about curiosity. I think it was it Einstein who said people call me a genius, but actually I just think I'm very curious. Something along those lines that he did that. The problem with that is it demands a lot of effort as parents. It does demand huge investment, because on one hand you can't just let the child go and take all the plugs out the wall. One, it's really inconvenient. Two, they're probably going to die, and that's an example. So I had to keep disciplining my son, that was his thing. But on the other hand, you don't want to squash them so much that they cease to become curious.
What do you mean by taking all the plugs out of the wall there?
I mean literally taking the power sockets apart.
Oh, okay.
Or finding anything he can metal and wedging them into it.
Oh, okay, right, yeah. So,
but now he's the managing director of his own tech company. So it's like, okay, how can I keep him alive without crushing?
This raises an interesting point, if I can just interject.
Yeah,
a friend of mine, Darren Diogi, who's been on the show as well, he mentions the concept of supervision, as in vision, but supervision from a greater height, just to use a metaphor. But the adult, the parent, the guardian, providing this awareness from a place of greater knowledge and knowledge and conceptual awareness, interjecting appropriately, as you had to there, for safety reasons. So curiosity, that's a great point. So curiosity, you're suggesting, it's a fantastic thing, but had you not been there, there could have been a bad outcome, which definitely points to the necessity for overseeing, for supervision, for guardianship, which I guess is, most people would say that's a given, but just wanted to dive in there with that point.
But that's the thing, it's not, because we live in such a high pressure environment, and I think I see this in other continents as well. It goes back, there has to be this intentional choice of what you want the outcome to be. So the outcome is, I want my child to be functioning at the level they feel at their fullest, doing what it is they feel they're called or able to do. Now, so I can't live my life through them, but on the other hand, I can't just be lazy. I want to keep coaching them. And you said a word there which I think is crucial, and if we go too far, please bring us back. But I do think this is absolutely key. It's the word awareness. Most people live in a state of hypnosis. They're really not aware. They wake up in trance state. They get ready to work on automatically. They get into the commuter system. They get the kids out of school, and they are in a form of trance. And if you say to people, "Why'd you do that?" "I don't know. I felt like it." because I did. And so it's as you develop an awareness, you become conscious of why you feel what you feel, why you do what you do, then you're empowered to make choices. If you can develop that awareness and then bring that into the learning environment, even in a traditional school, if you've got a highly aware teacher who understands leadership and understands what drives people, what their motivators are, they are going to have a far greater level of success than someone who thinks they've just got to keep them there till they're 16.
Absolutely.
That it's just about the process. No, it's much, much, much bigger than that. So if I had to pick on one thing, I would say it's awareness.
Absolutely.
Because the awareness will lead to knowledge. Because you go, oh, I don't know that, and then you're going to you'll pursue it, and you'll start to develop it. So it's being aware. When you discipline, don't crush curiosity. When you correct, help them to realize that with good intentions, we sometimes do wrong things, so that we're giving you feedback to make you more effective. Whereas very often in the learning environment, we've moralized mistakes.
Indeed.
So you get a procedural violation, and we bring a morality to it, and we call it bad.
Yep.
And no, the child has made a mistake. Punching an old lady in the face is bad. Not finishing your homework, that's not helpful. But demoralize it. Otherwise, the children buy into a self-image that's utterly destructive, and then they live up to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think awareness is key, and not only to develop awareness in the student, if you like, in the young individual or indeed the adult, but also in the parent and the educator. Really important.
100%.
And to come back to the definition we looked at earlier, knowledge is awareness in conceptual form. And what do we mean by conceptual form? But we mean thinking. We mean the uniquely human capacity to form a conception of a concept, I should say. Sorry. So there's all points back to thinking. So here's another little tangent then, and we've probably got some different ideas on this. But is it best, do you think, if we're encouraging young people to in an education or to educate themselves actively, is it best to allow them to follow their curiosity, or is it best to follow a prescribed curriculum?
I'm the person that when you invite me around to dinner, and on the table there are two delicious puddings, you say, which would you like? I say, yes, please. I'm not going to choose. They both look gorgeous. Why would I deprive myself of one of them? And I would say absolutely both. I don't see these things as in conflict.
Fantastic.
So the way we work is that we use a particular curriculum that takes an amount of time a day. We have any students, whether it's in the schools we work with or with homeschoolers, set targets, set goals, allow the child to take responsibility for their time, let them see that their choices have outcomes, and those can be really enjoyable or not so enjoyable. But on the other hand, let's fling the doors open as well and encourage the creative side. I think if you go just all one or the other, it's okay. But if you can get a really curious person who's very adept in the basics of education, you've got something very, very powerful there.
Fantastic.
And so that's what I prescribe to. I don't make the choice.
Yeah. On the strength of that, I'm going to have to come to you in your professional capacity, I think, and we'll have to talk about that, off camera another time. I mean, our as I've mentioned previously, my wife and I also facilitate our children's self-education in the home environment, but we could probably do with more structure and more prescribed curriculum. As I mentioned previously, I think that demonstration and explanation are very key components of education, stroke parenting, because they kind of merge. When you're home educating, parenting and educating, kind of, it's difficult to draw a distinction between them.
We're educating them all the time they're awake.
Absolutely. So demonstration, explanation, but also acknowledgement, trust, to trust them to do stuff, and then to acknowledge them. So these are the sort of four components of our approach, but it does lack some curriculum. I think this is very interesting for any listeners, any would-be home educators, or maybe any existing home educators. I'm certainly getting a sort of an aha moment in that bringing some curriculum in is a good idea. I have a 10-year-old son who hasn't mastered reading and writing yet, and this is okay. I mean, he can read some, but he's not zipping through books yet.
Yeah.
And you know, this is a debatable point. I mean, I'm aware that things like reading skills, as soon as, again, that curiosity and that volitional choice to do is engaged, it doesn't take that long, and he's got the foundation so that, you know, in a month, if he wanted to.
I was going to say 4 to 6 weeks. That's what it'll take. Especially
with the background of, you know, recognising words through just being alive and living a life with us. So thank you for that insight. It's great, because I was looking at that as a false dichotomy, and thank you for pointing out that really isn't. That's
really good.
So let's look at something else, unless you want to come back and talk about.
I just want to add one very brief thing. Is it might be helpful for folks watching this. Draw a line between teaching and learning, and what we want to do is teaching is focused on the teacher. The learning is focused on the student, and it's training the children, and that might not be a popular word with some people, but again, I don't have an issue with it. It's training the children to become self-learners.
Yeah.
And so we train them as much as possible through motivation, positive reward, because once they're a self-learner, and that's what we've succeeded with our daughters. My other daughter, it took her a bit longer, but suddenly it just all clicked for her, and she suddenly decided she loves English, she loves writing, and now she's in Cambridge, and she's studying at uni there.
Yeah.
But it is, I think it's that emphasis is it's about learning.
Yep.
It's not just about transmitting.
Yep.
It's once the child goes, oh, I want to learn, that's it, they're set for life.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That's a wonderful distinction. Again, in the light of what you've said, I don't have a problem with the word training. When training is in a context, okay, we're in the classroom today, or we're outside on the lawn, you know, whatever the situation. And today we're going to address this. We're going to learn. We're going to try and train ourselves to, you know, you might be training yourself to juggle effectively. So the use of the word training. If training was a broadly the whole method of dealing with children, we're training them to do things on rote, that I don't think would be good. But in isolation, I can buy into that term, that concept used constructively.
I would also just take that back a bit further, and this is kind of the bad news, I guess, is we're training them all the time. So, you know, when you're sitting at dinner, when you're watching the TV, when you're out for a walk, you are actually training your children, but as much by what we don't say as by what we do say. You know, so if we say, I don't want you to do that, and they do it, and there's no consequence, you've just trained them.
Okay, so that's kind of then, again, we're tying back to the idea of conditioning and things without thought. So, of course, our table etiquette, for example, every family has its own, unwritten set of table code, dinner code, whatever you like, the way the meals are conducted, what happens. And I suppose that in as much as that is not verbalized, it's not stated, it's implicit, that is training, isn't it? Or conditioning. So I'm unwittingly or not explicitly, perhaps is a better way of saying it, training or conditioning my children around the way we do dinner. You know, we say grace, we try not to talk over each other, we don't throw food at each other, we try and wait till everyone's served, and sort of all of these things are a form of training then. That's very, very, very interesting, and a form of conditioning as opposed to. But then they also do become part of the children's knowledge, would you say? Or am I...
Oh, I absolutely. I think sometimes we have to be very careful that when we discover a problem normally is exposed because of a success. So if you look at if you look at the history of this country, for example, we had women not getting the vote till the sort of late 1920s. And then we had the whole thing about inequality of wages. But that only became a problem once we'd had the success of getting them the vote.
Okay, of course, yeah. Yeah.
And then what we mustn't do then in getting women absolute full equality is throw away all the history that brought us there. And that's one of the things in our culture is we just want to throw everything away. You know, whoa, whoa, whoa. The reason we can now deal with that problem is because of that. And I think we do that and say, oh, these classrooms are so rigid, and we just throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, the bad news is, unless your child has a neurological or a physical disorder, if they're 7 years old and they're still not going to bed on time and getting up all through the night, sorry, mums and dads, but that's because you trained them to do that. No, I didn't. Yes, you did, because you can train passively just as well as you can train actively.
Okay.
I hate the fact my child watches all these programs. Well, it's because you trained them to do it. And that's a real tough pill. And, you know, some people might disagree with me. I'm happy to discuss it. But they come in, they're an open book. They don't have filters on their subconscious. And just everything we're doing, everything we're saying, we're just training or even conditioning. And that's a big, you know, we got to think carefully about that.
Okay. And again, in the absence of thought, I mean, one thing, I totally take that point. It's very, very helpful. I try to have a dialogue going as much as possible, more so with my 10-year-old son than with my nearly 8-year-old daughter and 6-year-old son, because they're not quite there yet. But my 10-year-old son, his capacity to reason is fast developing, and we try to discuss things. So as much as possible, I think the application of bringing a topic to the surface, 100%. As it were, talking about it, discussing it. I'm not saying this is the way it is, but you know, inviting him to what does he think about it, what do I think about it, just getting it spoken about, I think it goes a long way to it becoming more part of an education than a part of a conditioning and a training.
I 100% I agree with you totally. Is get them to see your world and you make sure you get to see their world.
Great. So there's an issue here amongst home educators, and maybe we're getting a bit niche into home education, but school at home versus the hands-off approach. I guess that's again a false dichotomy, and I'm preempting you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you would probably advocate a degree of hands-off. As in, let the children manage their own time, but also a degree of structure of, right, okay, today let's look at something specific.
Yes.
Have I got you right there in anticipating that?
Yes, I'm probably more structured than most people would be, because we actually use a curriculum, we set goals and targets, and you got to with work, but you know, we did that as an idea, and then our children decided what they wanted along the line, so they've all gone to different levels within what we've used. I think we've got to make sure as parents we're not just going for what's convenient.
Yep.
And sometimes parents, they pull the kids out of school but don't actually want the hassle of actually teaching them, and so you can just go, well, we're just letting them discover. What they're going to learn is by not applying themselves, they're going to be poor and no one's going to listen to them. That's the reality. Yeah. Look at the demographics in our prisons: illiteracy, numeracy, an ability to communicate, mental illness. That makes up like 80% of the population. So we, you know, as much as I advocate freedom's not license.
No.
You know, it's freedom to learn, freedom to train, freedom to choose. Well, I choose not to do anything. Okay, but you have to understand the consequences of that will be.
Absolutely.
Because as a culture, we cannot allow you just to run around like an idiot.
No, and I think the word consequences in there is a very important one, because as I said, I am coming from a more hands-off approach.
Yeah.
We and everyone's lifestyle, every set of parents will do things differently. My wife and I are continually demonstrating a number of things. We try to demonstrate an element of business sense and of entrepreneurialism with the things that we do, and we engage children in that. But also consequences, as you say, if we do choose to sit and play PlayStation all day, and effectively then develop a habit of doing that, then that will have consequences of, small likelihood you might become a successful gamer, but realistically, the consequences are going to be negative. So I think it's very important, isn't it, to try and illustrate that consequences happen. You know, cause and effect, a very important rule for them to get. Yeah. So let's move on, if we can, to what's changed in education. We kind of looked at last time where education's come from, and we touched upon the outdated classroom model, the impracticalities of the numbers involved, and the difficulty of getting attention into children. what is it that's really changed? I mean, the obvious one is the internet, I suppose, but how's the changing context of modern life changed education?
I think the problem is it hasn't actually changed enough. So the education minister, we have now, if you go into the schools, within their policies, is that we have to be seen to be preparing children for life in modern Britain. My slightly cynical self wants to say, well, which other Britain were we going to prepare them for? Now, what the government is acknowledging is that the world has changed. It's changed drastically. And we brought some toys into the schools, so schools can have iPads and they can have big flashy screens on the wall. The hard reality is, though, that if you go to places in developing countries where you've got motivated children sitting on a dirt floor with a slate, you put them in a test, they'll outperform our kids with all the toys. So what really has happened is that the education hasn't changed much, the world has. So education started as a thing for the elite, and then people with a conscience started to train the poor. And then the government said, well, OK, let's train the poor and we can have a more effective military. We can have a more effective industry. But it lacked humanity. We've now got to a point where we see being able to be a human as our right. We don't want to hang our humanity up with our coats when we come into the factory. But where we're struggling is we don't want to take responsibility for being that human. We confuse freedom with licentiousness, or license, that I can just do whatever I like, however I feel. No, a free person doesn't live like that. I think that's part of the issue. And so now we've got an education system based in a poverty mindset, from an industrial militarized age. And here we are living in a service-based connection nation. So you touched on something. We have got to bring entrepreneurship into the classrooms. We have got to start, the governments talk about careers and their intention is good, but the children have got to start understanding who they are, what's their big why. So I'm a person of faith. For me, I believe in calling, and I believe in divine purpose. But if you don't believe that, you've still got to connect to a why that's bigger than you, that here's what I'm going to do in my years on the planet. And the younger we can connect them to that, the more voracious they will be as learners.
Yeah.
And I use learners over being educated.
Right. So essentially then, education hasn't changed, or hasn't changed enough in your view, and I mean, now that you've said that again, that's great. I mean, I totally agree. But the internet has changed, the context has changed.
Yeah.
And the internet specifically, it's wonderful. It's facilitating this and people
Absolutely.
viewing it. It's an incredible source of information, and often it gets knocked because there's an awful lot of garbage on the internet as well. But if you just viewed the internet and your portal out there onto the web as access to the world, then the world is full of good things, bad things, rubbish, value. It's all there in a one great big mix. The trick is to discern and pick up the gemstones.
Absolutely.
So the it's interesting as well, because you mentioned that the context has changed, education hasn't, and an educational system, as I see it, tends to sort of try and do this sort of predict and provide model, doesn't it? Like road building or something, and it tends to, by implication, suggest that they know what the future is going to be like, and here's what you're going to need to know. And this is one of one of my big issues with the mainstream educational system, is that most of the time it's hugely out on its prediction of. I mean, nobody knows what's going to happen next week, let alone next year, or let alone 5 years time. So the idea of predicting specifically is really a nonsense. We have to agree that. But at the same time, you hit the nail on the head there, where your children are thinking ahead, they're planning ahead. So in the huge variable circumstances, and all economic collapse, it looms, and the collapse of the dollar, all of these things, we've got the dangers of Wi-Fi becoming exposed, and yet schools are full of Wi-Fis and iPads. There's a huge amount of knowledge is always being discovered, and the context is ever changing. So the mainstream, it seems to be completely out on its sort of predict and can provide policy.
I think you've hit it on the head. We cannot tell the future as much as we'd like to. If you go back, it's an interesting exercise. Look through all the doom and gloom predictions and all the super optimistic utopian predictions. They were all wrong. It's just, every now and again, this little prophet will stand up, a Churchill or someone like that. But generally, whatever the mass thinks, don't back it because it's going to be wrong. For me, and I'm very aware this is a huge subject, and this is just me, but I would say this with the children: give them the really solid basics, get them really numerate, get them really literate, and being able to think widely and appreciate the perspective of others, even if you disagree with them. To disagree doesn't make us enemies. It just means we see something differently. Maybe you're wrong and maybe I'm right, or maybe it's the other way around. But get them seeing both sides of the argument. And then I think Daniel Priestley just did something in one of his books recently, which I thought was really informed. And if you go back a couple of thousand years, everything was done manually. And then the Industrial Revolution kicked in, and then we had machines that were far stronger and faster than men. So the men then just ran the machines that did the work. Then we go forward and you get up to people like Onassis, and what they were able to do was bring in business systems and started to run huge empires, but without the massive intensive labor. They brought in the machinery and a different way of thinking. Then you got the computers came in, and what the computers have done is they think far faster than we can. My dad always used to say that they're very clever idiots. They can't actually think, but what they have, they can do really, really fast. He was sort of involved in the pioneering of that whole thing, and that has now got to the point where AI, even people in the medical profession, they better be on the cutting edge of the research, because give it 25 years, I'm going to come into my office, even now, if you live in London, you've got the NHS on an app on your phone. I have NHS apps on my phone. You're going to put in your symptoms, and that's going to be an AI that starts to diagnose you. You probably even won't type it in, you'll just say it. The only thing that we can't see at the moment that technology will be able to replace, genuinely, it can impersonate it, is connection. Is that human connection, that human validation, and the ability to think forward, to develop. Yeah. So if to be honest, if I was the school czar, I would be getting everybody have a real solid foundation, teach them to be flexible, get them to put their security into anything but their career, and then become phenomenal communicators. Yeah. Actually have public speaking, communication, emotional intelligence, have all of these things actually in the learning. And that's what I try to bring to my children outside of the curriculum. I wasn't very good at walking them through fields. Their extracurricular activities consisted of roller coasters and learning to connect with people.
Well, connecting with people is very important.
Because I think that's where it's going. I honestly think it's the kids who get that, and that's going to be often the homeschool kids. They connect better, they relate better to adults. They're going to be the ones who actually are going to start to pull away from the masses. Yeah.
I mean, I would say to that I think thinking is the human being's most important survival skill. And I think that is really the biggest thing we can teach, notwithstanding all the things that you've spoken, all the techniques that you've enlightened me to in this chat. But I think that as long as it's that question why, isn't it? Because
I think all of them come under what you've just said. They're under the umbrella of thinking.
Yeah.
If they can come out the other end thinking.
Yeah. Because once people, human beings, children, the next generation are thinking, then whatever problems we encounter, we can ask the question why, and we can fix it. It's as to the extent that we don't ask the question why and apply a process of thought, that's where the problems start. And I think there's a lot of things going in the wrong direction. Artificial intelligence, as you pointed to there, AI, I don't think it can ask the question why. Really, it can't. It can't apply. You can't.
Not unless someone tells it to.
It can't have a system of values because values they stem from the basic choice, universal choice of being alive or not being alive, which is something only a living thing can actually have. Only a living thing can develop a system of values. But that's another whole conversation. So yes. Well, actually, just picking up on that, some say then that education must include a specific curriculum of values, and maybe you can speak into this as a minister. But I would say, don't we learn those by following what is demonstrated by our guardians and people around us? I mean, we kind of pick up values in the same way that we pick up our philosophy. rather like osmosis. We tend to absorb it again. In the absence of thought, we sort of download it and it slips into the back of our minds, the values. So what role do you think, how prominent do values have to be in education in your view?
I think the thing with values is you're 100% right. You will teach the values whether you teach them or not, because the child might not be able to articulate them, but just by the choices that they see the people around them in the world make, they will then develop a value structure from them. I think the importance, or if I can say it, the value of teaching values is it creates an awareness. So that they can, they can see where they come from and see how they're steering their lives. So, oh, Dad, can I have some money? Well, I gave you your allowance a week ago. Oh, I've spent it all. But now I really want to do this. Well, which was more important? Well, this, or is it you're just living in the now rather than thinking more widely? So bringing the children to understand that they're taking actions based on their values. If they don't like the results, then they've got to question their values. And again, people often, adults, the problem is adults get really threatened with this kind of stuff. Or if they've not taught it, they're not aware. Just tell me I'm a good person and I'll be happy. Okay, you're a good person, but your values suck. And so again, if children aren't made aware, they're just not going to think of it. They'll just think that they're doing it, and you'll hear this. You see this so much now, and there's some very controversial TED talks have just gone up. Is you can't change this. You're just born with it. Yeah, I'd really, really challenge that. I think what you've done is you've made a series of decisions over time and developed a value that is now embedded and subconscious, and you think you can't, and maybe you can't, but there was a process that wasn't just stuck there.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very important to isolate, to learn, that classic quote, that, the wisdom to know the difference between what you can change and what you can't. And there's awful lot that we can change. And there's huge confusion around that which must be just accepted. So that's a very dangerous one. But you mentioned, distracted here by my phone going off.
No, I'm just now worried mine will start ringing because I haven't disconnected it.
Maybe we should wrap up. I know we're pushing on time as ever. This is very interesting, and I could go on forever. But just briefly, let's just zip it up here, Mark. Is education ever finished?
No.
Exactly.
But personal testimony, I left school pretty well with no qualifications. There's another story there. I was 30 years old. I was on the A10 between Cambridge and Ely. I was on the Streatham roundabout. I had a cassette in the car. It was the first set of tapes I bought on business. I think it was network marketing or something. It never came to anything. But the guy there said, "Why did you stop learning when you left school?" And that was just all the lights came on, and so I went back to school, and I've never left. If you're part of the expression of school, I'm on a journey, and for me, if the day I stop learning, I stop growing. The day I stop growing, I die.
Wonderful. I mean,
education is life. Yeah,
absolutely. And this is something that I'd like to hammer home to any listeners. The Matrix analogy, the Matrix metaphor. To be outside of the Matrix is to be thinking for ourselves. It is to be on that ever lifelong process of learning, and conversely, being stuck in the Matrix is to shrink one's awareness to be.
How fresh is the air out here?
Yeah.
I mean, you just got to get out, guys.
Yeah.
And it's not being a rebel. It's not being in the sense of being violent or hateful or aggressive. We're a friendly bunch. We're pro, but I'm addicted to freedom,
Yeah. Well,
and
me too.
I want my own thoughts. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, I hope this discussion has stimulated some thoughts. We've touched on a load of subjects, and you've certainly opened my eyes to a number of things about the education from your professional capacity, and I'm going to be talking to you about some of that
At your service
in the future, which is really exciting. And I hope for all you listeners that again, this is just inspiring, because we all need to think outside the box. We need to keep asking that question, why. Any value that we sort of absorb, we find ourselves thinking, why are we doing that? Question, why are we doing that? What are we trying to achieve? What's the end goal, as you've said repeatedly. So thank you so much, Mark, for giving us your time today and sharing.
It's a pleasure.
Sharing your wonderful insights with us once again. And there's so much to go away and think about there. Just remind any listeners how they might contact you in the same way that you've piqued my interest about how they might best educate their own children. Fire away with your contact details.
Yes, you can get me on Twitter at Mark Neale TV. Neale is Neale, or support at Mark Neale TV. You can email me on that one. But if you go onto Twitter at Mark Neale TV, you can direct message me from there.
Wonderful stuff. And any listeners, please feel free to visit the website www.lawfulrebel.com for all sorts of other information designed to get us thinking outside the box and addressing important lifestyle issues to help us thrive, to help us get outside of this conditioned response. Thank you so much for listening, and I do hope you'll join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Change you want to see.